Peace and blessings, family. Welcome back to another edition of What is the Time, a podcast about personal sovereignty, celestial timing, and living where the getting is good. I am your boy Zamboni, and I am here to take you on another journey with my main man today, one of my original herbalism teachers, Richard Mandelbaum. This is his second appearance on the show. I do encourage you to check out his first appearance. I learned a lot during that time. I know a lot of folks really dug that one. We are going to talk into health and wellness and what even am a person in the world. I'm very excited to talk about all of these things. If you like hanging out with us and if you would like to support the production of this kind of content, you can always hit up my Venmo, Cash App, PayPal at ZamboniFunk. That is super helpful. That continues to be helpful. You can check out my Patreon, which is, you can find an electional report there to help you to time your life. Just recently, I went on a first date and didn't elect it. Let me tell you, it was big trash. So this is a very useful document to have around. You can get an astrology reading. You can check out the music, Spotify, Tidal, Pandora. All of that is ZamboniFunk. You can go to ZamboniFunk.com, which is a central hub for all of these things. Thank you, as always, for being here. I super appreciate all y'all. And thank you, Richard, for showing up a second time. It's lovely to see you.
Absolutely. So this is a second date, I think, right? So
Indeed. So
yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, and if we want to talk elections, today is Thursday, March 30th. It is 10:17 a.m. And so we've got this really lovely Mars or Moon in Cancer trying to Neptune in Pisces. I think that's going to be really good for getting into the heady and weird and dreamy stuff. So I'm very excited to see what kind of things we get into here. So Richard, thank you so much for being here. What a wild 3 years we've had.
What are you referring to? Oh my gosh. Yeah. It just, I was actually online with some students yesterday and we were talking about kidney health and we got into kidney stones and we're talking about herbs and health for kidney stones. And at one point we just were laughing about, one student was sharing a story that one of her relatives ended up in horrible pain the night before the election, and it turned out to be kidney stones, and we were kind of laughing about that. And I said, it kind of feels like we've all been trying to pass a stone for the past few years.
Right.
So absolutely. And, one thing, to state something, I guess, probably obvious, but, it's not just COVID. I think we all went into COVID, so many of us, at least, just already reeling in different ways. And then that hits us, right? So
sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so as someone who is deeply involved in the practice of health and wellness and trying to bring people into health and this kind of thing, how has your concept of health changed in the past 3 years?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. To start out with, sort of personally, the most immediate thing I can think of in terms of what I've learned for myself is yet another very strong reminder to be humble. It's very easy, especially if you're someone who's giving people advice for a living or teaching for a living or things like that. It can be very ego feeding activity. And it's easy to get into that white coat expert mode. And I remember when COVID first, there were first the little rumblings of it. My immediate reaction was, we've seen this movie before, with West Nile virus and with SARS, and it's always a big scare, and then it's never as bad as they say, and so I just learned to shut up. So people will ask me, what do you think's going to happen? And I have no idea. I still feel that way about it in terms of like the future of COVID, for example. So I think being humble and realizing that the world is full of mystery, and these microbes have their own life and their own evolutionary path and the way they interact with us. And we don't know what's coming tomorrow. And I think it's a really important thing to hold in life in general, but with health as well. To not have hubris or an arrogant perspective on understanding, and approach it from a perspective of expertise, for instance. So that's talk I talked, but I think what it reminded me of was like, no, you got to walk this talk a little bit more too. So that's certainly one thing.
For sure. And have you noticed in clients or in students or in the world at large, have you noticed a change in how people seem to approach bodily concerns or health concerns or any of the rest of it? And how has there been a meaningful change in how people have done that? And has there been a meaningful change in how you then have to approach the navigating relationships with those people?
Yeah, good questions. I think like a lot of us who work in the area of health broadly, I've seen that there is, if anything, more and more awareness and more interest in natural ways to promote our own health. And when a crisis happens, you see the weaknesses as well as the strengths of a person, of a system, right? That's when it's all hanging out there to see. And so we certainly saw the biggest gaps and weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the mainstream medical system and the healthcare system, pretty much none of which have improved whatsoever in terms of learning from COVID. That's really frustrating. Do we have more hospital beds in case something like that happens next week? No. So anyway, we could go on about that. But I think what a lot of this, and this was even reflected in, not to bring it down to a monetary thing, but even in sales of herbs and supplements. I mean, when COVID first hit, herb shops were all out of stock. I mean, if you didn't have your mushrooms and your licorice and your thyme and like your elecampane, you're out of luck. Like everybody was out of stock for a long time because there was such a need and such a increased awareness of like conventional medicine doesn't really have much to offer us for help in this area. So that's been, if you want to call it a silver lining, that's been a positive thing. I think what's unfortunate within that, again, something we all see, I'm not sharing anything that's particularly insightful perhaps, but what's sad, I think, for me is how divisive it has come within health, right? Within society, for sure, we all see that. And again, not that those divisions weren't already there. I think this is like, seeing it erupt, it's like having a chronic herpes infection and are you in a flare-up stage or is it quiescent? It's always there, right? So I think everything we're seeing was always there. But I think what's unfortunate is even within health, people, maybe it's, a tribalistic nature of humans to some degree, although I think we can rise above it, but we go into our camps. And so even with COVID, for instance, are you in the pro-vaccine or the anti-vaccine camp? Well, isn't there a third option where we recognize everybody's right to decide for themselves and we see pros and cons and we can just have discussion even if we strongly disagree with someone? And that's on the vaccine specifically, but even, along with that, for instance, I sometimes hear people talking about, let's say, COVID and just how to keep our immune system strong. And again, kind of like a binary choice that people impose on themselves and on each other that's artificial of, for example, are you going to get vaccinated or are you going to approach your immune health naturally? And again, I think everybody should be deciding those things for themselves, but like whoever told you that was a binary choice, right? Mm-hmm. So and from both sides and both camps, and again, we all see this, like there can be just rather than disagreement, everybody making their choices, navigating through things, whether we agree or not, a very judgmental, condescending, harsh, kind of ugly attitude. And you see that from all camps. You see that certainly from the pro-vaccine side, kind of condescendingly judging anyone who might decide that's not what they want to do with their body. And then you have people talking about, betraying holistic health if they get vaccinated. And it's silliness, really, but it's ugly silliness. So that's one thing that I think is really unfortunate, actually, in everything that shifted. So on the one hand, we've got this opening and blossoming of interest in natural health. On the other hand, just too much dogmatism about it. And that's one thing within holistic health that I'm pretty wary of, I guess, in my life in general, but certainly within holistic health, there can be a lot of dogmatism. This is the way you need to eat, right? This is what you need to do. I can feel very elitist sometimes, and very kind of hierarchical and top down. And unfortunately, I think the things that have happened over the past 3 years haven't helped that any.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's interesting. You pointed toward a trending move toward natural health things, and I've noticed that there's been a huge explosion in not only herbal medicine, but also in just like I guess you could think of them as like behavioral changes as well. So we could think about diet, and we don't necessarily need to get into diet right now because there's so many different camps and so many different ways to approach that. But like the keto bros had a great time during the pandemic, right?
Yes.
And so then, but then also we've seen things coming into the mainstream, such as like cold exposure and red light therapy and this kind of thing as well. And so I wonder if you particularly, I have this question for me, and I don't know if this is going to be interesting to anyone else, but I'm super interested in it. I know that you have a background in traditional Chinese medicine. And so, I used to work in an acupuncture clinic. And so, I read The Web That Has No Weaver and spent some time, in that space or whatever, not actually educated, but like spent a little time in the space. And one of the things that, came up consistently while I was there was no cold. We're not doing cold things. Cold is going to constrict. And when things are constricted, then they get stagnant. When things get stagnant, then there's a buildup of things. There's excess, and the excess turns into pain. And so we're not gonna, we're not doing ice packs, for example, or we're not gonna eat refrigerated food, for example, and these kinds of things here as well. Also, cold exposure has come out, like ice baths, the polar plunge, and all this kind of thing. This has gotten a lot of press recently, and people are really loving it. So I wonder if you have an opinion on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It reminds me of the 18th/19th century herbalist here in the United States, Samuel Thompson. So if you're into like herbal history, particularly here in North America, he's a well-known, famous figure, kind of a interesting person to talk about for other reasons. But he famously said, heat is life and cold is death. And it reminds me a little bit of what you're saying. Of course, again, we can, I think, become overly dogmatic. I mean, I agree in a general sense that, drinking cold water, certainly ice cold water on a regular basis, things like that are not healthy for us. And they do shut things down. And it's interesting because we talk energetically about herbal medicine or within traditional frameworks, like whether it's Chinese medicine or Ayurveda, there's usually some energetic component where you talk about things being warming and cooling, for instance, or drying and moistening, and you're assessing what that person needs to bring them back into balance. So what if someone's exhibiting a lot of heat? Do you want to cool that down? And one of the things that I've come to in terms of maybe a more nuanced view of energetics is just because something's hot doesn't mean you want to cool it down. What you actually often want to do is clear the heat, let it clear and dissipate. So you're not just shutting it down, right? It's kind of like if someone's agitated, do you want to sedate them, right? That's like an emotional, energetic agitation and heat rising up, right? And it's all kinetic and dynamic and moving. It's very yang energy, right? But do you want to shut that down? Do you want to sedate that? Usually not. Right? Usually you want to figure out what kind of nourishing that person needs. And so if there's a lot of heat, yeah, you want to let that clear so that it dissipates, so it's not stuck, so it's not trapped, rather than thinking about shutting something down, right? And there can be exceptions. I mean, jumping into cold water, it gets your blood flowing. So it's not that I'm dogmatically 100% opposed to doing things, people doing things like that, particularly if they have a strong constitution, particularly if they're not already in a fragile state, right? These things can also help us determine what the body can do. Likewise, on the other end, you go into super hot saunas or the ceremony in the form of a sweat or something like that. If you're in a really fragile state, that might be just too extreme for you too. So I think we always want to look at the individual, but I do think there's something to that just trying to cool something off. You can be missing the point, right? Missing kind of the crux of what might be happening.
So you're not a cold plunge kind of guy.
I actually like the cold weather. I'm not so much a cold plunge kind of guy, but I love the wintertime. I'll tell you, getting out on a cold, brisk day and going for a walk, or if there's snow on the ground, snowshoeing or something. I absolutely love the cold weather and the cold seasons. And I love jumping into cold water, but not like winter frozen over with ice water. Haven't gone there yet. But again, I'm not necessarily opposed to that for everybody. I wouldn't make a blanket statement. I don't think we all necessarily have to go off doing that either.
Interesting. Cool. So, in general, I know that there's no generalization to be made, but one of the things that I come into a lot with my practice as an astrologer is I get the same questions a lot. And so I find myself sort of like repeating the same advice over and over. And so with that kind of thing in mind, I'm sure that you have a similar situation. What are some of the first principles that you'll use to design a health protocol, and what kind of stuff is like good for everybody to think about? Like, we can think about the way that like a liberal arts education will teach you how to think, right? And so how to read and how to think and this kind of thing. So like, how can we think about designing a health protocol?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there are the fundamentals that we can't escape, and they're going to catch up to you eventually. And certainly the majority of people who come to sit with me already are experiencing a health challenge. Now, that could be minor and they're getting ahead of things and being proactive. Very often it's like, no, it's a big challenge in their life by the time they find me. Sometimes people have seen 7 other practitioners already, and so they can be very layered and complicated. But a few things just to start out a response or a discussion about your question. If you're not sleeping well, you're not going to get better. And if you're not sleeping well, it's just a matter of time before it catches up with you. And we know the science is clear in terms of how that relates to cardiovascular health. And I mean, I'll work with people who have hypertension and their blood pressure normalizes once they start sleeping well. Certainly fatigue. So one of the big questions, to your point, that I'll get is, someone will ask me like, how do I get more energy? So, okay, low hanging fruit, sleep. And often people think they're sleeping well enough when they're not. Sometimes people know they're not, but often I'll have, especially younger folks say, yeah, I'm getting 6 or 7 hours a night. It's like, yeah, that's not enough. Unless you're unusual, unless you're an outlier, which you're statistically probably not. Like, you need an hour or two more than that. And sleep is disrespected out of the. So I talk sometimes about like the fundamentals of health, and I'm certainly not the only one to say this. Being sleep, physical activity, fulfillment and joy and love in life, and eating well. And along with eating well goes absorbing and digesting well. But out of all of those, I would say, I think in the current moment we live in, culturally, sleep probably gets the least respect out of all of those. All those others, not enough people are paying attention to, and certainly as a society, we're not paying enough attention to them. We got a lot of work to do in all of that. That said, I think even when you have a conversation with someone, sleep is the one that gets kind of short shrift sometimes, and there can almost be one thing I notice sometimes. And maybe this varies, certainly in the New York radius, I think this is true. There can almost be a little bit of, pride, like in a twisted way, at being sleep deprived. Oh, I'm not getting enough sleep, right? And it's not good for you, but it also means you're busy and you're active. And people feel guilty sleeping enough. So one thing I spend time on is actually, of course, if you have a health challenge, you need to figure out how to sleep better. Some people are trying and they can't, so you have to work on that. But honestly, some people just need to be told it's not only okay, you need to sleep more. They need permission to sleep well. And whereas with these other things, I don't think someone needs that same kind of permission to go out and be more active. They know it already, whether they're doing it or not, or to eat well or so on. But with sleep, there's like a guilt that can happen about like, oh, you're wasting time. You're not productive enough. There's very kind of, I think, capitalist mindset that we need to be getting shit done. This is what we need biologically. So sleep is huge. No matter what someone sits down with me to talk about, if they're not sleeping well, we're going to include that. Gut health, enormous. So not only what you eat, but what you absorb. Right. And both of those are equally important. So you can be malnourished, even if you're eating well, if you're not digesting and absorbing well. And again, getting out, getting active. You were talking earlier about behavioral changes that people have gotten more keyed into over the past few years. One thing early on in COVID that was very promising, I don't know if it's stuck, but was people getting outside more. My brother and his family went on their first ever real life hike early on in COVID because we wanted to all get together, but it's like, let's get together outside somewhere and let's go for a hike. And they said, sure, that sounds great. And halfway through the hike, they realized, I realized like, no, they've never actually hiked before. They enjoyed it, but they were picturing like a little walk in the woods. It was like, no, we're going up that mountain, which is a workout, and we're outside breathing fresh air and with the trees and with the beautiful views. And so that's something too that I find myself pretty regularly recommending is both being more active. We're animals. We're meant to move. We've got, we're basically big sacks of fluid, that are self-contained so that we can move around. And if we're not moving around, everything is going to stagnate. And that includes in our blood in terms of our risk of circulatory and cardiovascular health, but in our minds too. If somebody is stressed out or depressed or anxious, if you're sedentary, you are giving yourself out of the gate a huge disadvantage, an additional huge challenge. So even the things that get underemphasized about being active, like being emotionally balanced and joyful, is an enormous benefit of being more active in life. So forget about it's good for you, right? I sometimes joke, like we talk about exercise, like you have to go walk your body like you walk your dog, right? It feels like a chore. No, like you're going to feel better. You want to feel good, or you want to sleep better at night. right? So these things are all interrelated, right? We know, as like those of us who take care of kids, our parents or caretakers, that you got to get that kid out to run around during the day, or there's going to be trouble at night, and they're not going to sleep. And we're not different as adults. It's just a little bit more subtle. So being active, finding things that are fulfilling in life. There's nothing sadder, I think, if you start to talk to somebody about how they're doing and you ask, what do you do for yourself? What do you do? What do you carve out to do yourself? What fulfills your heart? And that might be related to your work and income and might be completely, totally different. Like, what are those things? Some people don't have an answer to that. And that's a sad thing. How can we be healthy if we don't have that? And of course, some people are much less privileged and are more challenged to even have the time and the luxury to find that. But we can help people, even if it's in really small ways. Like every little bit helps, I think. So that's another angle I come to with the work I do is you don't have to, and sometimes it's a mistake to put the bar way up here. If somebody is down here, you can paint that vision so we know where we're headed, but you have to help move that along. And with most things, every little bit helps. So I think that's something to hold too.
That's really good. So when I think about my own self and the way that I approach my health and this kind of thing, then I definitely, as an independent entrepreneur and this kind of thing, I definitely run into this disrespect of sleep. That's like a major problem for me, right? I'm hustle and grind a lot. And so and then one of the other things that'll happen is like, I'll get some time to like some time off or something like that. And then I'll be like, oh, but the sun is up. I should go outside and exercise. I should go run in the lawn and like these kinds of things, right? Like, I'll sort of like switch one of the other things that I've got, one of the other things in your fundamental list there for sleep.
Yeah.
And so like you said that you spend a fair bit of time sort of like helping people to feel better about getting their rest and their sleep and this kind of thing. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah. And again, all those things are important, but one of the things I like to do is tie things back to people's own experience and give people more than one reason. So, you should sleep more. Like that's next to meaningless. Like people know that already. That it's not helpful, right? But what is that you're coming into me with? You want to feel more energy throughout the day. Well, how realistic is it? If you're sleep deprived, right? And we get into that. Or again, somebody has high blood pressure, and I'll share, actually, you'll often see that improve with enough sleep. Or, so like tailoring it to what's going on with that person. And for me, this is one of the most important, maybe the most important aspect of, if I was going to define what a holistic approach to health is versus a more reductionist or conventional approach, it's about individualizing things. So yes, we're talking healthy food and organic foods as much as possible, and we're talking herbs and natural approaches, whatever that means. We could get into that, and all of that is important. But those are like the tools in a sense. What are we really getting at? And individualizing it is so important. So that's one of the, and you mentioned with food, right? People have all these different views. So it's a difficult topic to get into, but that's kind of the point I'm making at the same time, is like we can hold space for more than one approach, because I'm talking to you now. I'm not talking to the universe of humanity pretending that the same thing is going to work for everybody, right? And as herbalists, which well, Zamboni, is like, we talk about herbs and we always talk about having to individualize it for the person. But then sometimes I see the same practitioners talk about diet and say, this is the way everybody should eat. It's like, hold on a second. Does that really make a lot of sense? No, it doesn't to me. So whatever we do for ourselves, I've been vegetarian since I was 16 years old. The vast majority of people who work with me don't know that. because it's not about me. It's about you. It's about those folks, not about me. So what does this person need? And so to somewhat answer your question, how do you enter into discussions about these things? It's paying attention to you and what's going on in your life and what will make it more poignant, more meaningful to you. That sleep is important. And that's something that comes out of spending an hour with someone, spending an hour and a half, sometimes spending 2 hours with someone. And that's just one session, right? And then having a series of meetings where you're in a relationship now, working together and collaborating and finding, what those benefits you're going to see from this in your own life in a direct way versus, again, that sort of general advice of this is what we should all do to be healthy, which, doesn't really get you very far because, again, people come in the door already knowing that. Right?
Indeed. So before we move away from sleep here, I have lots of other questions, and I didn't even plan on asking you about sleep. But here we are, and I wonder if you think that there is something important about not only sleep, but dreaming. Do you think that there's something significant about dreams that is important when it comes to health? And what we mentioned last time in the last conversation we had is that the word health is etymologically related to wholeness. And so I wonder if dreaming is in some way important in the journey to wholeness.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think I mentioned to you before we started recording that I've been writing more poetry. I woke up this morning. Sometimes I just get a line in my head, and sometimes it just stays a line, but sometimes it goes somewhere. But I woke up having this strong sense that I had interesting dreams, and I couldn't capture what they were. And I just had this line in my head that my dreams do not want me to remember them. But anyway, I absolutely think so. I have a very active dream life. I have, you mentioned Chinese medicine. I have a very active Shen. So the heart, mind, and then the liver and the Hun, which is the soul associated with the liver. These kind of wander at night, and it influences our dream life. So liver and heart is where in Chinese medicine our dream life resides. And you can actually feel that in someone's pulse often. Sometimes on the tongue you see things too, but when I feel someone's pulse on their left wrist, the heart and the liver, the heart's the pulse closest to the thumb, and then the liver down below that, and then it's the kidney in below that. But particularly that heart pulse, if it feels like agitated, kind of jumpy, I'll ask people about their dream life. In both directions, somebody can have a dream life that's disturbing and anxiety provoking, but then some people, their dream life is deadened, right? And, some people just haven't learned or tried to remember their dreams, so they have a sense they're dreaming. It's a practice, actually. You can improve how well you remember your dreams, and even just small tips that can help you to do that. And I'll pay attention to that very much. I'll often ask people if they're dreaming. If someone never dreams, or again, sometimes it's that somebody's not remembering it, but it's certainly possible somebody isn't getting into a deep enough sleep, and that's significant in terms of sleep quality. But I do think it's this mysterious realm that is an important part of our lives, actually, to have an active dream life. And so, there are herbs that can promote active dream life. There are some that kind of temper it down. Sometimes that's okay to temper it down if they're moving into a more disturbing realm, at least temporarily. Sometimes tamping it down too much is a mistake too, though. So sometimes, for instance, with cannabis, as an example, I see people get tremendous benefit from cannabis for sleep. But then it's not uncommon, and again, everybody's different, right? But it's not that uncommon to, whether it's a few months later or a few years later, or at a certain point, to somebody to say, I think maybe I want to cut back on this or step back from it. One of the reasons being I'm just not dreaming anymore. And I do think cannabis is an herb that like cools down that liver heart energy, right? Particularly the liver energy. So it makes sense to me. But again, that's just one example. And the mugwort is used by a lot of herbalists to kind of activate a dream life. Hawthorn can be really helpful for when someone has a bit of an agitated dream life, just to kind of smooth the rough edges a little bit. I find it really helpful for that. Black cohosh. I'm naming specific herbs. I'm not sure if you wanted me to go there. But black cohosh is an herb I've been exploring of late for when people have true nightmares. And not to be overly simplistic about it, like what's behind it and what's going on and all the other things in someone's life that they need addressed. It's not like a single herb is taking care of your problem, right? And you know that. But black cohosh has an interesting personality and energy to it that I've found has an affinity to when someone's dream life is like going off the rails a little bit and waking them up and being scary and things like that too. So yeah, I think dream life is really important. It's creative, right? We're shutting down maybe that part of our mind that we're driving like a car, or pretending to during the day, and just letting it flow. And I think that's incredibly important, actually.
You mentioned something interesting there, and about Shen, and I've been meaning to do a whole episode on the heart and Shen and this kind of thing. But what do you think the heart is, and what is it doing? What's its job? Is it a pump?
So it's just a pump. Yeah, there's nothing else to it. We can move on. Well, it is a pump. It's a strong muscle, so it requires our hearts require oxygen constantly, right? For that reason, and glucose, and constantly using energy. But it's so much more than that, and in terms of the Shen, the heart mind, right? All of our all of our organs have their emotional side to them. So I often talk about like the lung mind and the liver mind and the kidney mind, and those are all interesting to explore because we'll often see things manifest physically and emotionally in the same way. I personally don't believe the body and mind are separated from each other. I don't think they're two different things. I think Western culture has created that to be. That's just my own belief about it. So for me, it's not even about addressing both body and mind when we're addressing health. It's like, no, let's deconstruct the division we created between those two in the first place. And so the heart mind, this ancient Buddhist concept, and not just Buddhism, for instance, ancient Egyptian beliefs about medicine and health very much link the heart to the mind as well. There are indigenous Mexican belief systems that very much link the heart to the mind and to storytelling and to joy and to fire. And you see a lot of, and to healing for that matter too. And so you see kind of multiculturally around the world that the heart for who knows how long, right, has been associated and is associated with our emotional selves. And so one of the ways I think about the heart is as a vessel. And that is something talked about within Buddhism as well. To be clear, I'm not a practicing Buddhist, so I'm very much a self-educated amateur at it. But it's something I spend time with and resonates with me. But we talk about clearing the heart. Emptying the heart, so emptying the vessel, and the heart is fire. It's our hearth, and it's prone to overheat. Right, it's prone to to becoming too fiery. So we often have to clear that heat and calm things down, right? And again, not by shutting it down, not by sedating that, but by clearing that heat and then nourishing at the same time. And the heart, I really see in that way as a vessel in terms of when there is a disharmony within the body, and by that I mean the mind and the body anywhere, that is something that often does arrive at the heart and affects the heart. That's where things land. And so, for instance, if you think about heart disease, except for a very small percentage of genetic disorders, for instance, physical malformations of the heart that somebody might be born with, which are real and happen, but statistically, those are the minority of heart disease in a broad sense, right? Like single-digit percentage points. The vast majority of heart disease does not originate with the heart. It originates with the kidneys, for instance, which regulate blood pressure. So blood pressure associated with heart disease, the heart doesn't have any ability to regulate blood pressure, right? It's primarily the kidneys that are doing that. We talk about our lipid levels, right? What are our triglycerides and what are our cholesterol levels? And we could get into all of that and the pros and cons of the hyper focus on cholesterol. But that said, things that gunk up our blood, essentially, right? Whether it's calcium, whether it's lipids, whether it's immune cells themselves, platelets, etc., that then begin to occlude our blood supply and can cause a heart attack or stroke. So the things we think of again as heart disease, the heart doesn't have any control over any of that. It doesn't regulate that. So the liver is regulating a lot of that. For instance, the parathyroid is regulating how much calcium's in her blood. So the heart is a vessel. It's receiving from the rest of the body and the mind, but it's where where we see the impact so often, right? This number one killer we have of heart disease, and of course, so much of it is preventable. But the heart is so prone to stress, to anger, to depression, and heart disease itself will cause or support these disharmonies coming into existence as well. So there's this back and forth flow. But again, if we have cholesterol, LDL cholesterol levels that are too high, that's liver regulated, but it's the heart that actually, in the end, we're worried about, right? So I think there's a lot to that. And again, that idea of the heart mind being, it resonates so closely with me, and being above all the other organs, sort of where the mind overall resides. And that's both our emotional mind and our intellectual mind. So it's our cognitive health as well as our emotional health, which I think as well are the same thing. I think there's a little bit sometimes within modern Western approaches to health and medicine where we can divide or segregate cognitive health from emotional well-being as if they're two different things, when we all know how closely interrelated those actually are. Right. Just a simple example. Sometimes if somebody's having trouble focusing and concentrating, besides sleep, to pay attention to, often they need to be calmed down. Right. Often you need to just calm, ground, and center and calm the anxiety that's getting in the way of thinking straight. Right. We sometimes jump to the superficial of you need to stimulate the mind and need nootropics to get everything flowing. And some people do need that. But some people counterintuitively, actually, you need to be calmed down and centered. And then that cognitive health is allowed to flow. So they're so closely interrelated with each other at the same time.
Interesting. So one of the trends that I've seen coming through in natural medicine circles recently is this idea that the heart is a cognitive center. Is you're thinking with your heart and you're thinking with your gut, right? And so then this leads me to the question, like, what is the brain doing?
It's a great question. And it's so interesting because if you look at, for example, traditional Chinese medicine, I can't speak as well to Ayurveda or other traditions. It would be interesting to look at those as well. But this question often comes up within discussions around Chinese medicine of like, what about the brain? There is very little attention paid to the brain. And it's an interesting thing. And there is, there are some thoughts in more modern neurology that are moving in the direction of thinking about our brain not as the center of our thinking and thoughts, but more so the coordinator of our thinking and thoughts. So how much does thinking reside in the body? And the brain it's almost, this is a poor metaphor, but can you picture like the black and white movie of the old fashioned operator kind of plugging in all of the plugs to make the connections between people's telephone lines and thinking about, maybe that's what the brain's actually doing. Because, of course, brain damage and disease, we know, affects our cognitive health, right? So it's clearly playing a role, but maybe it's more that operator coordinator versus like, this is where it all starts and happens and everything else is just physical. And there are some neurologists who are starting to view it perhaps that way too. And that is what I think a lot of traditional approaches do too, is you don't, it's another way of separating mind and body from each other, just saying the mind is just here and then everything else is just body, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's interesting to reflect on for sure.
Totally. And so one of the things that comes up here is this idea that, all right, so you've got a heart mind and you've got a liver mind and you've got a kidney mind and all of these kinds of things, right? And this sort of leads back to what we were talking about in the last conversation, which was around Lynn Margulies and James Lovelock's. They were the first one who proposed to Western biomedical audience the idea that the world is sort of like a meta living being, that it's one organism. The whole world is one organism, and so one way that I like to think about that is like, I am a cell in the body of the living world, right?
Yeah.
And so if that is true, then we can think about the human mind as a mind in the same way that like the heart mind is a mind, which is distinct from and also contributes to this like larger global network of minds or something like this, right? Mm-hmm. And so with that in mind here, or with thinking into that, then what do you think the role of human is in the larger Gaia organism?
Yeah. And are we currently at risk of or already cancerous, right? Uncontrolled growth. So
real quick, what is cancer?
Uncontrolled cellular growth is how I would define it. It's interesting to try to define it, and I think as we are learning more and more about cancer, we are it's indisputable at this point that it is a natural process in the body to develop precancerous and early stage cancerous cells. And it's actually a challenge now within modern medicine because we have scanning technologies that are so exacting and detailed now. We're now able to find it all at early stages, and we're finding a lot of it that we don't even have a clue will one day cause a problem or not. So there's the risk of over medicalization, and that's why you see statistically that mammograms, unless you're at high risk, are questionable in how effective they are, because they certainly help save some lives, but then they over medicalize a bunch of lives. Or prostate cancer, where now, unless you have an aggressive, fast growing cancer, which is different, the modern medical attitude is often just like, let's just wait and monitor this, because you'll probably die of something else. You'll die with the prostate cancer instead of from the prostate cancer, is something often said. So when cancer is a problem, cancerous cells are our own cells, right? To be clear, they're not. It's not an infection, but it's our own cells. Now, what causes it? You get into all sorts of things, and certainly, I would say, one thing when in public health discussions of cancer that gets to me the most in a bad way is that we don't really talk about prevention, true prevention, which in my mind, step number one is stopping the production and release of known carcinogens into the environment. Like, you'd think that'd be pretty obvious, right? But there's a lot of money behind that. So it never gets discussed. It never gets, not by those folks, right? It's always a war on cancer. Right? How about a war on carcinogens to start that out? But doesn't go there. So cancer is a problem. Cancer is a risk for us when it either grows in situ, meaning localized, and you get a tumor that begins to interfere with function of an organ, for example, and it just growing large enough that organ is no longer able to function properly. So that's one way that cancer can cause health challenges. Or if it metastasizes and spreads through our blood and through our lymph, and then begins to grow tumors and masses in other places. And cancer cells don't generally go through apoptosis, which is like regulated, scheduled cell death, right? Our cells live and die like we do. They have their lifespans, and different types of cells have different lifespans. Neurons have long lives, and red blood cells have shorter lives, and so on. So, but cancer cells tend to thwart that, so they continue to live and they continue to multiply, and they are great consumers of energy. So we begin to become highly malnourished as well. So we get interference with organ function depending on where those tumors are and what they're doing. And we get a kind of starvation from within from all of the energy usage that this uncontrolled growth is sucking from us nutritionally. So if cancer cells remain isolated, small, not growing much, not spreading, that's not a problem. So like a lot of things, if we change our framework and think about, it's not about cancer or no cancer, it's about what is it that triggers something to then become a problem. And this relates to, so we could keep talking about cancer, but I kind of got off on a tangent from your really good question, which is our place on the planet. And so, I'm certainly not the first one to make that analogy. For instance, I don't know if you're familiar with Vandana Shiva, the Indian activist, and she says, like, capitalism is a cancer, right? If anything based on uncontrolled growth, where the more growth the better ad infinitum, that is not health, that's cancer. And I even shared this recently with a business class I did for my herbal students, right? So business meaning like, how do you make a livelihood from being an herbalist, which that resonates more with me than the word itself, although the word business derives from the Old English for anxiety. So that's another question, another interesting thing to talk about. But that said, you don't have to buy into what we're being told is the case, which is being successful in life means always growing. So your income always increasing, your business always growing. And if it's successful, sales are always more than they were last year. That's not sustainable. So very much, if you look at modern role of humans on the planet right now, that's kind of what we're doing. It's just uncontrolled growth and consumption of resources, just like a cancer within our body. But we don't have to be that way. Like I'm not a cynic on that level of thinking this is human nature in any way. We have been here on the planet for a long time without being that way, and we have it within our capacity to not be that way, to be more in symbiosis, right? So that's really the question. And what you're getting at, are we in symbiosis as a member of an ecology, as a member of an ecosystem? So like our individual cells, or like our mitochondria within our cells that are descendants of bacteria living within our cells to mutually symbiotically coexist with the human body, or all of the bacteria in our microbiome, in our gut, or on our skin, 99.9, probably higher percentage of bacteria and microbes are either harmless or beneficial to us as humans. And it's just a small number that we might need to be somewhat concerned about, right? It's the exception, not the rule. And so symbiosis and mutualism, thankfully, is being more and more recognized within ecology, within science, within medicine. Not enough, not quickly enough, but it speaks to our role on the planet, because I agree with you very much. These are fractal layers, right? So even with the microbiome, there's often this isolated kind of discussion that goes on within holistic health of like how to promote your own healthy microbiome, as if the foods you eat and the probiotic pills that you swallow is going to really get you there. And it's not. I mean, we do those things because we're in this world. We do what we need to do individually. So I'm not saying to not do those things, but that will never get us there, because our microbiomes are imbalanced and depleted, because our ecology is imbalanced and depleted. One of my favorite studies, if we didn't talk about this last time, if we want to get geeky about a study out of Finland on the microbiome and allergies, it speaks to that very much. But the point being, I agree completely. What is within is without. We happen to live on this particular fractal layer of existence, and there are things both smaller than us and larger than us. And so that concept of Gaia is simply a larger fractal layer of what an organism is. Because if we look at ourselves and see, as an organism, I'm actually an ecosystem. I'm a symbiosis of many different organisms working together, both the human cell itself, which is the product of endosymbiosis, and all the microbiome and so on and so forth, right? And then we go out a layer and we realize we're eating foods and using herbs as medicine. And so we're in relationship with all of this, right? We've co-evolved with all of this. And so can you take that to a layer, a fractal layer that is beyond our direct perception of planetary? And then, of course, we could wonder what comes next. And that's an interesting conversation, too, because there's always something larger and something smaller, right? And there are people who think about that, even that, what's that next level then? And that's interesting. But that's that concept of Gaia. And if you look at the way the Earth's organism works, the regulatory structures in our atmosphere, in the soil, in the oceans, is very much similar to the same negative feedback loop regulatory mechanisms that our own endocrine system uses and our nervous system uses. And it's just one layer up.
Okay. So this cancer analogy it's given us a lot to think about then with that, if so then the question remains, what if What is a not cancerous human job? Like, what is our role?
Right. Plumber. No, yeah, I'm just being facetious with the question. Yeah, it's the right question to ask, and it's a challenge to us in modern living, because even when we're conscious and aware of this, we are constantly bombarded with ways in which we could be doing damage to other people and to the planet unintentionally by the anonymization of consumerism, right? That we buy something and don't see it. We don't know it. We're not there. We don't know what impact it's having. And we're just looking at that thing that we need or think we need or want. And I do this as much as, well, maybe not as much as some, but I do it, right? We're all consumers, right? And unless we're completely opting out, which is a beautiful thing, but most of us aren't going to do that, like really, truly opting out, not only off the grid, but like nobody else knows you're even out there. There are ways we as humans could do that, but most of us are not doing that. We are social animals too. So I think that's maybe too much to expect of us. I think that's both our strength and our weakness as a species. Usually those two are the same thing, is how social we are. So it's in our nature. It's not in our nature to completely opt out, right? We do what others do. And within that, there's a lot of flexibility for ourselves and our own values and principles. So it's a constant challenge we have, where do things come from? Are they based on human rights violations and on environmental pollution? And you see what just happened in East Palestine, for instance, and the train derailment. And then we follow that up with, pollutants leaking into the Delaware River in Philadelphia, telling everyone to drink bottled water. And we've got lead in Flint and lead in Newark, New Jersey, and lead all over the place. Just a lot of people haven't looked for it. and all of these challenges that we've got that we are constantly, even those of us who want to, right? This, it's hard. Because I think part of the challenge is we have to make our individual choices as best we can. We have to do that, but that won't ever get us there, right? Enlightened consumerism will not save us from the damage that consumerism causes. And I think sometimes there's too much emphasis on that. Well, you go buy the electric car now, you go put up solar panels, or you make sure you're buying direct from a farm and you really know that they're doing it right and treating their workers well and everything. And, first of all, how much time do we have in the day to do this in every single way? We don't. We do our best, right? I do think if more of us just did a little bit, like that would change a lot, actually, right? And so that kind of thing is important, but I do think ultimately we need societal level changes for this to happen in a broader way, right? Again, kind of what we do as individuals being so important, but also recognizing the limitation of that's another side of a materialistic, ego-based culture. Like we're saying, do you see yourself as you're you? This is me. This is me, or is all of this me? Right. So, ironically, I think holistic health or alternative health can also be too focused sometimes. It's maybe not as different culturally under the hood as we might think it is. If we're just saying, well, we're using herbs instead of pharmaceuticals, and it's all good, but are we still just looking at me? My health is about my choices that I make versus what we do as communities and as society. And that's a lot tougher. Not enough organizing in the world is part of the solution, I think, for us to just organize more as communities and make a change that's a bit broader, right? Which is my best non-answer to your question.
Indeed. I noticed that.
Yeah, but you asked what job, and I mean, we can think about those things, right? What are we contributing to? What kind of world are we creating? What are we leaving behind? And so many people around the world, to be clear, don't even have the luxury or privilege to make a choice about how they're getting by, right? But for those of us who have that privilege, it's sad to see that some people just are doing it. They're just making their money. They're not happy. They're not fulfilled at all. They don't feel like they're making the world better in any way. And that's the saddest thing, when it's somebody who does have that capacity to make a change. They might not feel like they can.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, so I think maybe you were getting a little hung up on the word job here.
Yeah.
Because, so like you mentioned plumbing, for example, right? And I would say
we
that
need plumbers.
Totally. And there are plumbers. If we think about like the fractal layer of the human body, there are plumbers, right? There are kidneys, there are bladders that do that kind of job, right? And so like, what I'm getting at there is like each of our minds, each organ's mind, and each organ, like we all contribute in our way that is specialized to our form and function. What we do based on how we are shaped and our relationship to everything else is what generates harmony and the life of the organism. And so if we think outside of 2023 and like how do I stop buying Tide Pods or whatever it is, right? Then like if we think outside of that and just think about, okay, well, what is a functional human in the body of an Earth?
I love the question.
What is that?
Yeah, I love the question. But it's interesting to think about, can a cell realize what it's doing within the body? And maybe yes, but maybe we also don't have that full capacity to see ourselves. It's kind of like, as a practitioner, the advice that even if you have a lot of knowledge in an area, if it's your own health challenge, you got to sit with somebody else, because you can't really see yourself objectively. So, but it's interesting still. It's a really interesting question. One thing that comes to mind that might get at it a little bit more on point is, a lot of evolutionary biologists look at humanity and how we got here, and that we're just really good generalists. Like, you can pick any one thing that humans do, and there's probably other species that do that thing much better than we do. But we do a little bit of all of it. Maybe we're the handyman. Maybe we're the generalists, just able to kind of make connections and, stick our noses for good or bad, right? But in your context of what you're putting on the table, in a good way, in a symbiotic and mutualistic way, kind of dabble in lots of different directions and make connections between things that might otherwise be disparate from each other.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Making connections makes me think about the brain, like you were talking before, like like the telephone operating board and this kind of thing, like being like, oh, this one wants to talk to this one, so let's make that connection happen. Mm-hmm. So that's just based on what you said earlier. So I don't have any real theory there, but it's interesting.
Yeah, I like it. Definitely. I like it. And I even think about gardening, for instance, and humans have been cultivating. We're not the first species to cultivate. As far as we know, that's the ants that have been doing it longer than humans have existed. That said, we've been doing it for a while, much longer than the 6,000 years or so that's like documented, quote unquote, archaeologically. There's no doubt in my mind this actually predates that by a huge amount, just in a way that's harder for modern archaeology to detect, because it's not about cutting down trees and then planting straight rows, but much more symbiotically, what in a modern context might be called permaculture, but like how to shape an ecosystem in a way that is subtle and still in alignment with the ecology. And, you know, when the English colonists first got to what's now the United States, there were a few different accounts by colonists who didn't know when they were in wilderness or in a cultivated space. They couldn't recognize it because, you know, the English gardens, everything, you know, 90-degree angles and rows and everything else is cleared. And so what some people might call permaculture, right? In a modern way, where like, no, they actually, our cultivated spaces are so ingrained in the ecology around us that it feels more seamless. And it's supporting that ecology rather than fighting it. And I think about like all the ways, for instance, that we even introduce plants. I mean, the beautiful ways that corn, for instance, you know, as far as we know, originating in Central America and Mexico and then spreading, you know, over centuries and thousands of years as people learn to grow it. So introducing a plant that wasn't there before, but in a way that can be really beautiful and healthy. And even when I go out into my garden in this tiny micro way, but introduce a plant, like I get jazzed up about like, you know, can I try a plant that I've never tried before? And, you know, some of the Chinese herbs, for instance, which can be really happy in our ecosystem. And so that also makes me think about that connecting, right? That coordinating, like making a connection in a way that hasn't existed before. And maybe that is like a role that we play for good or bad, right? In terms of ecologically good or bad, but that humans have done for thousands and thousands of years of sharing seeds and sharing knowledge and sharing skills and trading that feels reminiscent of that to me as we talk through it.
Yeah, I really like that. And listening to you talk, you've used the word ecosystem and ecology a lot here. And that reminds me of the way that it was the auntie Robin Wall Kimmerer who brought this to my attention, who said that eco is actually, that comes from the Greek oikos, which means home. And so ecology and ecosystem, as well as economy, all have this sense of like homemaking here. And just as an astrologer, it's interesting to note the difference between ecology and economy is very similar to the difference between astrology and astronomy, which at one point were the same craft, right?
Totally.
And so we can think about humans as perhaps being homemakers, right? As being folks who cultivate the home dynamic here in some kind of way. I'm riffing. I don't have any idea, but it makes sense to me.
Yeah, it makes complete sense. So, and again, it's not that we're the only animals that do that. Look at how a beaver shapes its environment, or a bird building a nest, or an anthill or termite colony, which are magnificent things. But this is something we do excel at as humans, right? Is creating space, and that can be in concert with what's around us or not. At least temporarily. If it's not, I don't think that's sustainable in a literal way, right? But yeah, no, that makes very good sense to me. And the distinction, I'm glad you brought it up, between astronomy and astrology, for instance, reminds me of that distinction again in the modern setting we've made between the mind and body, for example. Like we've segregated and divided things into binary categories, art versus science, right? There's a lot of different ways we could look at that, which do not have to be in different boxes whatsoever. It's a construct we've been told to view from.
Yeah, I can think about really deep physicists as being like some of the heaviest philosophers you've ever heard in your life, and this kind of thing. Like mathematicians, they get real wild with it, and it turns into creativity and art super quick at that level. And so,
absolutely.
And this one thing here that feels resonant to me is this idea of like, okay, so the brain is not the center of the thing, right? If we're going to go with this human brain thing, which may or may not be a good analogy, but let's run with that for a second, see if it fits. So if the brain is not the central, most important singular thing, right? Because you're thinking in your gut and you're thinking in your heart and you're thinking in your liver and whatnot. But we can also recognize that the brain is an important bit of what's going on here. Then this sort of like, so humans then are going to have an important role to play in the thing, and that's what I've been trying to like get at here for a little while. And so this kind of so it's important for us to remember that the brain / humans are not special, right? We are not different than the earth. We are part of the earth. We are the earth, right? But at the same time, we can think about how there is something that is different about us, to my mind, at least. So we can think about how, like, humans, for example, are not the only creatures who demonstrate language capacity, but we are the only ones who seem to leave written records, and we are the only ones who leave. Oh, and speaking of written records, we can think about the god form Thoth, who is the god of both magic and writing, right? And so there's a capacity to perform magic, which is associated with the act of writing, and it seems that we're the only ones who write things down. And then there's also generating monuments. There's also mastery of fire, which may or may not be a good thing. We can take qualitative stuff out of it, right? Prometheus got in trouble for giving us the fire, but here we are with the fire anyway, and we seem to be the only ones who have that kind of mastery. And so we are not necessarily better or worse than the others, but there is something that differentiates us in some way here. Do you have opinions on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's all very interesting. One thing is if we do end up offing ourselves through all this, that's one possible future, is we are, and everything you just mentioned is part of an evolutionary dead end that will one day be this super thin layer in the strata of the earth that maybe some future species will discover, maybe not. But it's like, that was an experiment gone awry, is one possibility. We don't know that, right? But it's interesting to reflect on, again, I think strengths and weaknesses, just on a smaller scale in our own lives, often are the same thing, right? And so maybe that's true as a species as well. And it's interesting because I always go to the level of being humble before that. For instance, does the beaver know the ways in which the beaver is different from everything else? And not being a beaver, I don't relate to that or don't see it, but maybe that is true. But yeah, I mean, clearly, no other species has built a vehicle to take them to the moon, as far as we know, right? I mean, we're doing stuff. We're doing kind of interesting stuff, right? What does it all mean? I'm not sure. We're clever. We're very clever. That's an aspect of humanity, right? And again, that can create amazing things or get you in some trouble. So we're seeing both of those, I think, at the same time, deriving from that cleverness. But it's interesting that the writing makes me think of Socrates, who allegedly said that writing and reading kind of makes you dumber, because you can then rely on what's written versus having to really understand it and be able to express it yourself. You can just parrot back something you've read and say, oh yeah, I know that. And of course, that is something that happens all the time. The irony, of course, is that we only know he said that because Plato, his student, wrote it down.
Right.
But anyway, yeah, it's all interesting to think about. But cleverness is one thing certainly that comes to mind as you talk.
Yeah. Well, I just like so because I and others in the sort of like natural whatever space, we tend to sort of like try to get away from the notion that humans are special and therefore given dominion over all of the rest of the world. While at the same time, I just like I don't know how to square that with the cleverness that you called it, you know, like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I'm with you. I'm with you. We have power, right? I think is part of what you're talking about. We have power. So why do we have this power, right? How did that come about? And certainly we do, right? That creative, constructive power and destructive power. I'm with you. I think there is that distinction, and again, does that lead to something, or does that dead end? I think is a question that's pretty close before us, actually, right? We've created the ability to off ourselves within minutes with nuclear weapons, which I think don't get talked about enough. You know, the Cold War ended and everyone pretended we no longer have that capacity. And of course, climate change and you know, unsustainable growth and so on. You know, where I think we're at very much that inflection point of being powerful. Right. I think that's what you're referring to, or what I'm hearing. I don't want to overinterpret, but yeah, and reflecting on why us, but I don't know.
Word up. Yeah, let's lean into the mystery there a little bit. So let's imagine for a moment here that we did have the opportunity to interface with an outsider, right? You mentioned that if you have your own health maladies, even as a health practitioner, you still need to go and sit with someone else because having that outside perspective can be really good. And so let's imagine that an outsider were to come to the earth. What and who do you think they would be interested in communicating with?
Yeah. So I think I mentioned to you last time we talked, I've been wanting to do a bit more writing, and I and that's still a work in progress, but made some changes in my own life to open up more space for that, and have been doing a bit more writing of poetry and an occasional prose. And one of the things that I had an idea for was a story, just kind of along the lines of what you're saying, of some mysterious alien arriving at the Earth and humans kind of slowly waking up to the fact that there was a presence and getting both scared and alarmed and interested and curious and wanting contact and communication, all the things, right, that are science fiction tropes that we see all over the place. And the only question is it going to end well or poorly for humanity, right? So depending on the movie. But in this case, the humans are just completely ignored, and it turns out the alien species is tapping into communication with the trees, and along with that, the mycorrhizal network that is connecting those trees with each other through those underground fungal colonies, and completely uninterested in humanity.
Yeah, that reminds me of Take Me to Your Leader. And it's like, well, who's really making the decisions here? It's kind of the fungi, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So from a a more objective standpoint, from a non-human standpoint, would it even be humanity, or would they say, wow, here's a weird little infection that's doing some harm and growing unsustainably, and that's not even the interesting aspect of the earth, of that Gaia, right? That's more like, something's going on there. Maybe they'd want to fight the infection and help Earth to heal, right? In which case, yeah, that's not good for us on an individual level. But maybe that's the other lens to that. Maybe that's another science fiction story of the other side of the story to aliens taking out human beings. It's about saving the planetary organism. All a little bit dark and cynical, but I think it gets to that point that, from our own fractal layer, it's hard for us to even see that. And to your point earlier, we're not special in the sense of having dominion, but we are special in the way, I do believe that, but in the same way that the oak tree is special, or that ants are special. It's marvelous, right? So I think we can also go too far in just denigrating ourselves, and right. So like, okay, we're cancerous. If we were just saying that, like, yeah, we're doomed, we're cancerous, like, that kind of giving in to self denigration is not, I think, what we want to do either. But in recognizing the marvel of what we are, but without that having to mean that we have superiority, right? To me, that feels like what resonates, and maybe what will help get us out of at least some of the mess that we're in.
Sure. Yeah, well, I mean, if you had liver cancer, then you wouldn't want to obliterate the liver, right?
Depends. If you're a conventional oncologist, you might. Yes, I agree with you.
Word. So I would, one other thing that we are sort of getting into in this historical moment that I think that is really interesting and worth figuring out a little bit, especially given the past 3 years that we've had, and the enormous interest in virology and this kind of thing, is so when I was a child, when I was in elementary school, then we learned about life, and they told us that viruses are not alive.
Yeah.
And I wonder, is that true? What is life anyway?
It's an interesting conversation, and I'll talk about viruses specifically in a minute. But just to your point earlier, when you said physicists in particular can get very philosophical, and that's absolutely true. I remember hearing Neil deGrasse Tyson, for instance, once say that, well, depending on how you define life, we can definitely look at stars as alive. So just kind of waxing philosophical, right? So it does very much depend on how we define those things. And with viruses in particular, yeah, that's kind of a thing to say they're not really alive. It's just like a little conglomeration of RNA and proteins. And but here's what I would say as a rebuttal to that, I guess. If viruses are not alive, what are they? I think we need at least another word if we want to say they're not alive, because they're not rocks, right? They reproduce, they replicate, and they evolve and adapt. I mean, we all saw this with COVID. We're continuing to see this with the new strains coming out. They evolve, adapt, and replicate. So if we want to say that they are not alive, I think it just begs the question in my mind, what are they? Because they are also not what we usually define as non-living. They're clearly different from that. So to me, they share more in common with life than non-life in that way. If we want to invent a new category, that's fine. But, viruses don't get the respect that they deserve. We have 10 times estimate, probably off, but current thinking, 10 times the number of viruses in our microbiome than we do bacteria. A lot of those viruses are actually living inside the bacteria. Viruses are tiny compared to, bacteria, and depends on the type of bacteria. There's a lot of diversity, but bacteria are not that different in scale than a human cell. They're smaller, but they live within the same fractal layer. Viruses much smaller, and they can enter into a cell, and that's generally where they replicate, and they enter, and different viruses target different types of cells potentially, and that genetic material, that RNA material that viruses carry, depending on the type of virus, can also make its way into our own chromosome and become part of the human genome. So there's a Japanese study, for instance, some Japanese analysis that's been published that's, again, estimating. I think we don't know enough yet, but gives a pretty good logical estimate that probably around 8% of the human genome, of what we call the human genome, is viral in origin. It's from viral infections over millennia and millions of years and hundreds of millions of years, because it predates us even evolving into being human, that what we call the human genome is actually in part viral. And it gets to that whole question yet again of what are we and what is the self? And actually, we're a conglomeration of different organisms. And that some of our most basic immunological and neurological functioning and physiological function may actually in part be what we have learned, so to speak, from viruses. So there are more and more people talking about the virome. So we have the microbiome, and we've seen this beautiful revolution over the past 20 years, particularly over the past 10, I would say, of there being much more public awareness that bacteria doesn't mean bad. Right? That, okay, there's good ones and bad ones, right? Which is overly simplistic too, but that's an improvement. And that has not yet happened with viruses. And I will say, for obvious reasons, it's not good timing for that argument. But it is absolutely true. We would probably not exist in the first place, never mind be able to carry on, if it were not for viruses in the world. And same thing with bacteria. It's only a very, very small percentage that have even the potential to act as antigens and do us harm, so to speak. And then, of course, we can get into the whole question of the germ versus the terrain and supporting our innate health to combat that or minimize that or reduce that likelihood on top of that. So that can get nuanced as well. But even just on a more basic level, if we think about infection-causing viruses, quote unquote, it's a pretty tiny number of overall viral species in the world. And I think that's a next step that we have to take as we go both larger and smaller. But as we go smaller is recognizing and studying more and researching more the benefits and mutualism that exists between viruses and ourselves. And again, we're making progress with bacteria, at least, and it's very exciting. I think we're barely scratching the surface of knowledge with the bacteria either. But with the viruses, it's not even in the public discussion quite yet. But I think it's coming.
Cool. That is very interesting. And we are getting close to time here, so I want you to we do need to be aware of the time and everything, but I really gotta ask you, what is the role? There are indigenous cultures, especially in North America, that I've heard about that would say that water is life, that these things are sort of synonymous or congruent. And so what is your opinion on the role of water in what we conceive of as life or living generally?
Yeah, that is a beautiful question. I think I mentioned this earlier in a very different context. We're basically sacks of fluid, right? If you think about the human body, the animal body more broadly, we're kind of self-contained sacks of fluid. It's almost like we are aquatic organisms that are just surviving out here in the dry air by constantly guzzling water. And you can see even within that, intuitively to me, it makes sense that what is believed to be scientifically our origins, and again, lots still to learn about that, that we don't yet know. But that said, both plant and animal life all points to, and microbial life points to, origins in water. And to me, that makes intuitive sense just looking at us as organisms, right? We are so water dependent. We can't go without. You could go without food for a few weeks. You won't feel good, but you can survive. But water, few days, we're oxygen even more. So breathing, interacting with the atmosphere even more viscerally, a few minutes, right? So, but water is there. We're constantly needing it, and so to me that makes sense. And one thing that's interesting, because one aspect of science, there's an alternate universe in which I became an astronomer, because I'm fascinated by that. But that wasn't the path I wanted to go for a number of reasons. But that said, I do consider myself a stargazer and interested in thinking about that even larger fractal layer of things. And one of the things that's been interesting for me is having been tracking that field for a few decades, since I was, teenager-ish, in my 20s, etc. The search for life outside of the Earth, that discussion has shifted. There were always many people who thought that could be probable, if not just possible, but probable or likely. But now it's almost undisputed. It's almost like a universal consensus among people who work in astronomy and astrobiology and biology more broadly that, there must be life elsewhere. And one beautiful aspect of that was not previously known, but now is very well established, is that there's water everywhere. There's water everywhere. So we used to think, at least I had the conception as a kid or growing up, that one of the things that makes Earth special is all the water we have. But there's water actually everywhere. In fact, Earth is not even the place in our own solar system that has the most water. The current estimate is that Europa, the moon of Jupiter, has a warm liquid ocean water ocean that has more water in it than the entire planet Earth. And Pluto is basically a big ball of water ice. And it's now thought that water is actually a natural product of star birth and evolution. So water is something that it's turning out seems to be everywhere. That doesn't necessarily mean life is everywhere, but setting up that foundation for there to be life throughout all of it. And that, yeah. So I think there is a lot of truth to that wisdom that we see in that big cosmic scale, but then again, on just the most basic level, and to perhaps turn it into something banal and specific, dehydration is rampant. Folks, you got to drink your water. And that's sometimes the most basic, to turn full circle on our conversation. One of the most basic and helpful recommendations for your health is to drink enough water. And people often don't. And we need it. We are water. We're mostly water, right? And just like our cousins, the trees, we're dependent on it, right? And we see their leaves shrivel up in a drought like we had here in the part of the world I live in last summer, and we're shriveling up the same way and challenging our kidneys and getting headaches and causing all sorts of problems for ourselves when we don't recognize that relationship that we have to water and that need to be constantly taking it in.
Oh my goodness. I don't know why I waited till the end to ask that question. I have like 400 more questions that you have brought up this with that response, but I'm aware that we all have other things to do. Thank you so much for coming on the show and blessing the whole internet with this super interesting conversation. I'm so delighted that you've been able to come through another time.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. And if you can think on this, but if you ever in the future want a third date, just reach out. I'd be happy to.
Oh, for sure. Without a doubt. It's on the way.
Yeah.
Is there anything you would like to tell the people? Anything you would like to plug, or a reading recommendation, whatever you like?
Oh boy. I mean, in terms of plugging, I mean, certainly folks, particularly if you're in my neck of the woods, which is the Southern Catskills, so kind of New Jersey, New York region, I do a lot of classes and workshops and plant walks, and you can get that on my website, kind of signing up
I
for
recommend those plant walks.
Nothing I enjoy more than just getting outside, and I'll probably be teaching some additional classes going forward. A lot of the teaching I do is for school programs, so it's if you're an enrolled student, but I'm going to probably be expanding to do a bit more in the future, just offering in general. So that's the best way if you go to my website and sign up for the newsletter. I'm not on social media. The main reason for that is because I just get too much screen time already, and I have to have time to go take a walk outside. So that's actually it's not like a firm against or anything. It's more just, I need to shut these things down and go outside. But that said, in terms of, oh boy, things to read. I did pick up, I don't know if I'll find it. I think it's actually in the other room, but I picked up a beautiful book of poetry recently. Do you want to wait a minute and I'll go grab it?
Do it.
This is a book of called "The Clouds Should Know Me by Now," Buddhist poet monks of China. I'm just working my way through it. So when you ask a reading recommendation, it's something I'm currently working with. Can I read a short poem from it?
Please do.
So this is called "Don't Ask." Don't ask if I'm out of touch with human affairs. Kings, marquises, I leave all to them now. Boorish by nature, no harm if I let it show, the way I did when I lived in the mountains. In quiet moments, I enter the soundless music. In my madness, reject properly ordered poems. I act for myself, look after myself, hoping the man in charge will understand. That was written in the year 921.
Okay. It continues to resonate to this day. Awesome. Well, will you put that book up so we can see it? Love it. The clouds should know me by now. Love it. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Richard, for being here, for sitting and thinking these thoughts with me and with us, and for exploring all of the things that are so important for us to think with in this life. For folks who are listening, if you want to support the ZamboniFunk project, you can always hit up the Venmo, Cash App, PayPal. You can go on Patreon. If you want to check out the breath exercise, it's called Breathe. It's on Spotify, Tidal, Pandora. It's on Bandcamp, wherever you like to get your music. I highly recommend that. We were just talking about how without the breath, you would die in a few minutes. What if we were to key into that? Could we make ourselves more powerful? I think that we can, and we can do it in a beautiful way. So thank you all for doing that. Thank you, Richard, for being here, and thank you as well to the ancestors who have made this way possible. Thank you to the descendants, which will take whatever we give to them, and for putting up with that. We give thanks to our cousins, the trees, our elders. We give thanks to the water itself, which gives us life, and to all of those who I don't want to take the time. If I named all of you, then it would take all damn day to give the kind of gratitude that is actually deserved out here in the world. We give thanks to the one Most High Creator, Jah Rastafari. Thank you all so much for being here, and I look forward to seeing y'all next time. Peace and blessings.